I think they're probably eagerly going into their various social media accounts and deleting all the nasty things that they've said about him in the past as quickly as possible. Will that make any difference? Probably not. I think the truth is that the EU is crumbling, NATO is crumbling. I think the EU will probably go under before NATO does. New governments are coming to power. Germany, which is in total disarray, is going to end up with a new government. And that may be the first of several, as we've seen in Great Britain. Again, you have to look at the economics of the situation. Look at the bond yields in Germany, the bond yields in England, the bond yields here. Despite everybody's efforts to suppress interest rates, those yields are going up. And the underlying fundamentals economically in terms of production, they're just terrible. So, and the banking system is the other piece. So our banks, from a systemic standpoint, are 8 times worse off today than they were in 2008. You just have to listen to the financial analysts who tell the truth and are very open about it. You know, people like Nassim Taleb, I think Gundlach, what's his name, Druckenmiller. There are several others, Michael Faber, all these people are saying the same thing. They're right. So that's the other elephant in the room, is this enormous debt load in our weak position and the supposition that we can simply print money into perpetuity. All of that's going to come apart over the next few months.
Douglas Macgregor's analysis shines a light on a crucial moment for the West, as both the European Union and NATO face mounting economic and political pressures that threaten their stability. Macgregor's observation on the aftermath of Donald Trump's recent re-election hints at tectonic shifts in Western alliances, as leaders scramble to adapt to a world where long-standing structures are under unprecedented strain. The economic backbone of the EU is wavering. Germany, traditionally the economic engine of Europe, now faces critical economic and political uncertainty. Industrial production, once a hallmark of German prosperity, is faltering. The energy crisis that began with strained Russian gas supplies and surging energy prices continues to drag down manufacturing output, leading to rising costs, falling exports, and diminished investor confidence. The impacts are most visible in Germany's bond yields, which have sharply increased, signaling higher borrowing costs and reduced faith in Germany's ability to sustain its previous levels of economic output. Macgregor's mention of bond yields rising across Europe, despite attempts to suppress them, underlines the degree of instability that cannot simply be papered over by interest rate manipulation. The political landscape is equally fraught. As Macgregor points out, Germany could soon see a new government, which might well represent a shift toward policies aimed at addressing domestic concerns rather than upholding EU stability. If Germany turns inward, the ripple effects across Europe could be profound. Other nations might follow suit, prioritizing domestic agendas over EU cohesion. This trend is not limited to Germany. The UK has seen multiple leadership changes in recent years, each new administration facing a public increasingly skeptical of political elites and frustrated by ongoing economic strain. The EU has long been heralded as a model of economic and political integration, but Macgregor suggests that these ideals may be on the brink of failure. The euro, once a symbol of European unity, now faces pressures from divergent national fiscal policies, with some nations more heavily indebted and vulnerable than others. Rising bond yields signal not only increased costs for governments, but also declining market confidence in the EU's long-term stability. Countries like Italy, already facing high debt-to-GDP ratios, are particularly vulnerable, and a significant economic downturn in any member state could trigger broader instability across the bloc. Macgregor's analysis implies that if Germany, the EU's cornerstone, undergoes political upheaval, other member states might quickly reassess their commitment to the Union. New governments in member states, elected by voters increasingly frustrated with economic stagnation and rising costs, could prioritize national interests over collective European goals. The fractures are apparent, and as each state grapples with its own economic challenges, a true EU crisis may loom just ahead. Alongside the EU's troubles, Macgregor notes that NATO is also facing internal disarray. Though NATO remains a military alliance, its purpose has become muddled by competing priorities among member states. Recent conflicts, such as the one in Ukraine, have exposed differences in how NATO members view their roles. Some, like Hungary, have openly criticized NATO's approach, particularly in its involvement in Ukraine, which they see as too provocative and not aligned with their national interests. Trump's re-election brings the future of NATO further into question. During his previous term, Trump was vocal about reducing U.S. commitments to NATO unless European members increase their defense spending. Now, his administration may pursue an even more isolationist stance, focusing on domestic issues and reducing financial and military support for NATO. For European members, Trump's return to power means re-evaluating their reliance on the U.S. and considering how prepared they are to defend themselves without heavy American involvement. If NATO fails to adapt, this period could mark the beginning of its irrelevance, as member states become increasingly divided over issues like military spending, responses to Russian aggression, and the role of the U.S. in European security. One of Macgregor's central points is the unsustainable state of the Western banking system. He claims that, from a systemic standpoint, banks are 8 times worse off today than they were in 2008, when the global financial crisis shook the world. This statement underscores the massive buildup of debt and economic risk within the financial sector. Western banks have leveraged themselves heavily, with governments and central banks creating unprecedented levels of liquidity to prevent a collapse. However, this approach has simply delayed the problem, and as inflation rises, banks now face increasing pressure to rein in debt, a task made all the more difficult by soaring bond yields. Noted financial experts like Nassim Taleb and Mark Faber have echoed similar concerns, suggesting that the banking system is precariously balanced on a mountain of debt. The era of easy money, where central banks could print their way out of crises, may be ending as inflation erodes the value of currency and pushes up interest rates. As debt servicing becomes more expensive, banks face a reckoning that could lead to widespread financial instability. Macgregor's warning is clear. The Western financial system is not prepared to handle a major economic shock without significant fallout. Macgregor's observation that European leaders are deleting all the nasty things they've said about Trump illustrates the anxiety his re-election brings to the West. Trump's potential for an America First foreign policy, where allies are expected to shoulder more responsibility, could force NATO and EU countries to reconsider their reliance on the U.S. For European leaders, the reality is stark. They may no longer be able to count on automatic American support, both financially and militarily. With Trump in office, NATO's cohesion may wane, particularly if member nations are unwilling to significantly increase their own defense budgets. A new foreign policy approach from the U.S. could push European nations to seek alternative alliances or even consider a more neutral stance in global conflicts. Trump's re-election signals that the Western alliance cannot remain static. It must evolve or risk becoming irrelevant. Macgregor's analysis hints at a global power shift, where Western dominance is increasingly challenged by a multipolar world order. Russia and China are expanding their influence, economically and militarily, and their alliances with non-Western nations like Iran and Turkey grow stronger. The West's traditional power bases, economic clout, military alliances, and diplomatic sway are eroding as new power centers emerge. China's Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, has deepened its ties with many countries previously within the Western sphere of influence, while Russia's military partnerships provide alternatives to NATO. The emerging multipolar world introduces complexities that Western leaders are not accustomed to. Countries once reliant on Western aid or alliances now have options, as they can turn to Russia or China for support. Macgregor's viewpoint suggests that if the West does not adapt to this shift, it risks losing its influence and relevance in global affairs. Macgregor's critique of Western banking and debt raises questions about the need for fundamental economic reform. The era of unchecked debt accumulation and reliance on central bank interventions may be ending. For the West, this means confronting a debt crisis with solutions that prioritize sustainable economic growth over short-term fixes. Policies aimed at reducing national debt, stabilizing interest rates, and improving productivity are necessary if Western nations hope to maintain their economic strength. Yet, implementing these reforms presents significant challenges. Reducing debt and government spending may be politically unpopular, as they often require cuts to social programs or increases in taxes. Nevertheless, the long-term stability of Western economies depends on addressing these structural issues rather than ignoring them. Macgregor's insights suggest that the Western world stands at a crossroads, with old alliances strained and economic foundations under threat. For the EU and NATO, the coming years may be defined by their ability to adapt to new realities, whether that means recalibrating alliances, addressing financial vulnerabilities, or preparing for a world where U.S. support is no longer guaranteed. As bond yields rise, political discontent grows, and new powers emerge, Western leaders face the challenge of either evolving with these changes or risking obsolescence. Macgregor's words resonate as a wake-up call. Without meaningful action, the West may continue to lose ground in a world that no longer waits for it to lead. According to Douglas Macgregor, I think they're probably eagerly going into their various social media accounts and deleting all the nasty things they've said about him in the past as quickly as possible. Will that make any difference? Probably not. The truth is that the EU is crumbling. NATO is crumbling. I think the EU will probably go under before NATO does. New governments are coming to power. Germany, which is in total disarray, is going to end up with a new government, and that may be the first of several, as we've seen in Great Britain. You have to look at the economics of the situation. Look at the bond yields in Germany, in England, here in the US. Despite efforts to suppress interest rates, yields are rising, and the underlying fundamentals, production, economic stability, are just terrible. And then there's the banking system. From a systemic standpoint, our banks are 8 times worse off today than they were in 2008. You just have to listen to the financial analysts who are open about this, like Nassim Taleb, Jeffrey Gundlach, Stanley Druckenmiller, Mark Faber. They're all saying the same thing, and they're right. The other elephant in the room is the enormous debt load and the weak economic position we're in, underpinned by the assumption that we can just print money perpetually. But all of that's going to come apart over the next few months. Thanks for watching.